Dear friends, my name is Ngali Bernard, and you are welcome to Beyond Africa. On this edition of the Beyond Africa podcast, we are examining if foreign aid has been effective for the economic development of Africa. Actually, some studies estimate that African countries have received about $1.2 trillion in foreign aid over the last 30 years. But the question that arises is, why hasn't this amount of foreign aid helped to contribute to Africa's economic development? That is going to be the onus, that is going to be the substance of our conversation today. And when we come back, I'll introduce my guest to you. You are welcome back. Let me introduce my guest to you, Mr. Glen Dhliwayo, who is a Development and Policy Analyst. He's been observing development on the continent, and he has a lot of opinions. He's formed opinions that he can share with us as we converse today. Glen is someone who pays critical attention to developments on the continent. And he has been following up developments, and he's
I'm sorry, Bernard, I've lost your sound for a minute there. Are you still here? Sorry, Bernard, I've lost you.
We are sorry for that mix-up due to technical fault, and happily we are back. So as I was saying, Glen Dhliwayo is our guest today, and he's a development analyst. He pays keen attention to what is happening on the continent. And of course, he's going to share his insights with us, what he thinks about development, what he thinks about foreign aid, and if Africans should continue down the route of foreign aid, or if we should change the approach if we want to attain economic development. Glen, you're welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Bernard.
It's a pleasure to have you here. I know we met our spaces on X, and we're talking about the Africa-South Korea Summit. And you made some very insightful contributions during that spaces. And I thought, why should I not invite you to the program, to the Beyond Africa podcast, so that you share your insights with our viewers and kind of let us understand where you stand and what we can be doing to improve development on the continent. Because what is observed is we are a continent that needs economic development. Did I capture your perspectives correctly?
Thank you very much for giving the context to how we met and why this conversation is going on today. I think you do capture my sentiment quite clearly. And the sentiment is that I think we need to have a redefinition of the way Africa, redefinition actually, and a reimagination of sorts of the way that Africa relates within the global geopolitical sphere. So in that conversation, I think it started off where we were discussing the South Korea Summit, the Africa-South Korea Summit, and we were discussing if it is going to benefit Africa. So yes, I think you do capture my interest in the topic and the need for the rest of Africa to actually come together and discuss that.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing in that perspective. And I was just wondering if you have any direct impressions about that summit that you would like to share with us, because it falls within the perspective of aid, right?
Yes. I think starting with that, the broader context of that conversation is to say that Africa is often invited to these, international summits, bilateral, multilateral, or, where we are treated as a bloc together and summoned by one singular country, particularly maybe countries in the G7, in the G20, to discuss how we can have what is termed as mutual economic cooperation and sometimes development cooperation. And then what is interested African political analysts, development analysts, and general citizenry of Africa we're concerned about is that, is there any substance, any tangibles that we derive from these summits, or is just another scramble of Africa again? I speak of that in particular reference to the historical term of the scramble and partition of Africa, where the then global powers were competing for the actual land of Africa, leading to the colonization of Africa. But what we see right now is something that is akin to that. It's not directly colonization. It's not the subjugation of our people into, political servitude. But it is the question that we are having, that is this a new form of, let's say, neocolonialism, or is this indeed development? So in attempting to question that, we then particularly went and zoomed in into the Korea Africa Summit. And I think some of the sentiments that were key for a lot of people that were in that particular space, and generally in the African continent, as you see on the internet, is that a lot of Africans are asking, including thought leaders, why Africans have to fly different heads of state, in particular for the Korea South Africa Summit. I think for the South Korea Africa Summit, I think it was 25 heads of states, 48 delegations from African countries, to meet in South Korea to discuss what was termed as the collective future of Africa and South Korea. And one would question, first of all, the premise to say, why are we not having this international player who's interested in partnering with Africa as a bloc coming to Africa, instead of having heads of state actually going there? So that is the first point. And then when you look at the joint declaration that was issued after the summit, you then realize that in as much as there were sweeteners there, the real issue was that South Korea wanted to have, a share of the particularly mineral resources, and they refer to them as critical mineral resources. And I think when we're looking at the green revolution, sustainability, and where the world is going, you then understand some of them are lithium because of their need in powering electronic gadgets, electronic vehicles. And we were looking at how African heads of states are negotiating these kind of deals, not only isolated to South Korea, but broadly thinking around that. You then also realize that one of the major themes that came out of there is that South Korea, for example, the clear overseas development assistance that was offered is to countries like Tanzania for Zanzibar infrastructure, Ethiopia the same is for infrastructure. And then the promise that South Korea made, I think it was 14 billion to be directed towards South Korean companies so that they're able to trade with Africa as a bloc. And then obviously for South Korea to gradually increase its overseas development assistance towards Africa, I think to the tune of 10 billion, if I'm not mistaken. Now, one of the things that I found a bit of discomfort with there is that, it's akin to most of the deals that Africa signs, you look at it and see that there is no actual money that is flowing into Africa. What is happening is that the global powers are creating a budget to make their companies, their local companies, more competitive to be able to trade with Africa. Now, when that happens, they put 14 billion towards South Korean firms. These firms are able to export, right, finished products to African economic territories. And when they do that, what is happening? They're mopping up the dollars that are within our countries. They're effectively stifling. This is an unintended or intended consequence of stifling industrial development and economic activity in those countries, because what you're receiving in Africa is finished products that you are buying at the end of the day, you have exported, as Africa, you have exported raw materials, critical minerals. You have exported your cocoa, now you're importing chocolate. You've exported your lithium, now you're importing electric vehicles. And there's a markup there, and that's where we're saying our leaders and heads of states need to start thinking around how do they make this trade and these interactions and these kind of deals more equitable, not only at a country level, because it then cascades to the economic realities and lived realities of their citizens.
Thank you so much for that brilliant intro. And I didn't want to cut your flow, but I had a series of interjections that I wanted to throw in there.
Yes.
The first one was just the basic fact that our own heads of states and governments decide to file themselves along a line and go sit in front of another head of state of one country in some sort of a position where they receive lectures or are told how the relationships is going to be between that country and the whole continent. It already plays onto the mind of the African leaders there. They appear there as beggars. If I'm not mistaken, the current president of Burkina Faso, he actually made that comment in Russia. He said this should be the last time. But when you look at the trend of events, do you really think that was, anyway, Russia came before South Korea. He said
Yes.
Russia should be the last, but South Korea came after that. Do you think in the next 4 or 5 years, our leaders would stop going to these countries and maybe impose that these countries should come meet them on the continent?
I think we first have to examine and face the reality here. And the reality is that there is global inequality. So that inequality is reflected even in these kind of setups to say who goes to who, right? So even when you're looking at it from a layman's point of view, what makes sense logistically? Let's think about that. Does it make sense for 25 heads of states to leave the business of running their countries to go and attend one summit to one leader of that country? Or does it make more sense for this leader of this country who intends to engage the African continent as a bloc to come to Africa? Other people have proffered other solutions to say, doesn't it make sense that maybe Africa should also unite and have, because we have systems, we have global, we have regional blocs, so we can look at them from like a sub-regional level. We can look at them at the continental level, right? So we've got ECOWAS, we've got COMESA, we've got SADC, we've got, I don't know, many other blocs that we have. Then we've got the AU. So doesn't it make sense that the AU should organize itself in such a way that the economic development department or international engagement department, then it has a representative that goes there with the head of the African Union? Or maybe the African Union Secretariat goes there. And then where there is need for something to be symbolic, then the chair of the African Union of that particular year goes to sign the deal with the country that is summoning us. Or doesn't it make sense for Africans to congregate in an African country, which makes more sense logistically, which makes more sense even when it comes to perception? Because in politics, perception is everything. Now you have a scenario where already you are looking as a beggar, and indeed we are. Right now we are in that place where, as a continent, we're engaging not as equals but as second class, as beggars, and that is also because of our economic condition and where we stand. So I think what we do need is a paradigm shift. It's a paradigm shift in our thinking. Like one of the things that you ask yourself is, as soon as an African leader is inaugurated after being elected, what is their itinerary looking like? Their ideal itinerary. Which engagements are they going to tout more to their people even, Is it the one where they're invited to Washington? At what expense? Maybe what needed to make more sense to them at that particular point is to reach out to their neighbors because they have common problems, they've got shared challenges. But most often, our leaders take pride in saying that they've been invited by the head of state, photo moments, even when they then go to international conferences, to international bodies like the UN. They are always looking for that photo opportunity, sometimes even when there's nothing tangible that is coming out of it. So I think we do need that paradigm shift to then think about first of all, what is the narrative? Why are we the ones going there? Who came up with the idea of this summit? And when they were drawing the agenda, were we a part of it from the beginning, or we've been invited, we're given the agenda, we're given the itinerary, and we show up and we do as expected and we come back? So to answer you directly, Bernard, I think there is that element that, yes, we do come off as beggars, and our African leaders are alive to that. I've seen speeches where the president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, has spoken about it. William Ruto has also said it. But lo and behold, when South Korea called, they were on the flight, they were there.
Yeah, that is the irony that cuts across when you look at the continent and look at how we carry ourselves along.
Yeah.
If we are going to South Korea to say we're looking for investment deals, how much does it cost one president and his whole entourage to travel to South Korea?
Yes.
What if that president decided to delegate his ambassador in South Korea to attend that summit, and then he takes the money that was supposed to have been used by him and his entourage to get to South Korea and invest it back in the country? Is that not going to be more reasonable? Is that not going to make more economic and investment sense than spending maybe tens of US dollars, tens of millions of US dollars to go look for investment money? Does that really make sense? I think it doesn't. And your perspective is quite reasonable, and telling us to work along our regional blocks to bring the investment to get at home is necessary. I've come across people who say this, the relations with these countries are not important. We should focus on Africa and develop on Africa. I take a different view on that. We actually need to do the international trade, international investment, international relations, not both for the trade and investment purposes and also for geostrategic reasons. But that does not mean that we should eliminate all our reasoning faculties or all our kicking away the advantages we could draw by investing in ourselves and appearing as beggars on the international scene. Because as you said, perspective is all. Once they know that we are coming as beggars, we are beggars.
Yes.
So it's necessary that our leaders also factor this when they are making those decisions. What do you think?
I think we make a grave mistake if we just focus on this one particular thing, which is a symptom, right? So, for example, getting fixated on these summits, and I understand the anger, because quite often you see 50 heads of state. Quite in most cases, they're very old men, gray-haired, congregating for a picture with one foreign leader. This is a symptom of the real issue that I feel like we need to talk about, and I like the way we have framed the conversation we're having today. And this is about foreign aid, overseas development assistance, and how all of this is working for Africa. So for me, I think the greater conversation that we need to talk about is the inequality in global trade, the inequality in global finance, and how that results in some of these things that we're speaking about. So the summits, I think we would not want to disregard them. I think it's very important for anyone who says they want to lead a country to have a plan of action for bilateral engagement, multilateral engagement, and how their country is going to play in the international community, in the global geopolitical community. Because again, at country level, countries have interests. And this is a reality that we cannot change. Countries are always going to have interests. And what we now need our leaders to do is to be able to clearly define what we need in this particular time for the development of our continent and the development of our people. So that even when they are going to these kind of forums, this kind of conferences, this kind of summits, we have a clear understanding of why this is happening. The problem that we have is that Africa itself, as a whole, Africa is an ideological consumer, right? So we don't have homegrown ideologies. We are a policy consumer. In actual fact, when you look at what is happening in Kenya right now with the protests on the finance bill, you realize that part of that is because of this very reason we're speaking about. That a few months ago, the Kenyan government had a preliminary arrangement with the IMF, where the IMF stated to them that for them to get a loan, for them to get finance, they have to increase their revenue. And what is the one way the government thought of increasing revenue? They thought of doing that through raising taxes. Raising taxes on daily commodities such as sugar, such as bread, such as cooking oil. That affects who? Who is going to be most hit by this? It's not the political elites, of course, it's the poor. So these things are supposed to be understood from these very basics to say, as countries, as African countries, what are our ideologies right now? So many times I hear people throwing terms like Pan-Africanism. What does it mean? How do you translate that into a policy? For example, into a policy to say, I'm a Pan-Africanist, therefore I believe as Africans, it should be easier for me to move from one African country to another. So free movement of people, free movement of goods. But quite often we see people, they get time to speak on podiums, and then they speak so much about how they're Pan-Africanists and how they espouse these values. But when it comes to actually drawing policies, they make it easier for people from Europe, for people from the USA to be able to access their economies, to access their markets, to access their borders, to enter their borders, harder than the people in their countries. One of these examples that you understand is, do you realize that sometimes it's expensive for an African to travel between one African country to another than someone to come from Europe to an African country? In some cases, one has to fly to maybe Paris, then connect to another African country. So these are the kind of things that we need to start thinking about as a continent, to say, whining about it, complaining about it is not progressive. It's good to be able to note this inequality, to be able to note these discrepancies. But it also is time for us to start thinking and coming to the drawing board and then saying, but really and truly, what are the needs of the African continent? So if we then go to these summits, we are going not as second-class citizens. We are going as equal economic partners of these countries. Right now, I do not see that equality, and I think that is where the problem is.
Thank you so much. You mentioned critical minerals when you were talking about the Africa-South Korea summit. And I think the critical minerals narrative is a golden opportunity for Africa to bargain for effective bilateral trade and investment processes. The reason is this. There is the push for the energy transition, and the energy transition comes with new technology. New technology needs these critical minerals, and these critical minerals are present in Africa, and most of these countries, most of their companies need to come extract the cobalt, the lithium, and all the rest from Africa. Why don't we take this advantage where most of the Western countries have set their climate change standards? They have environmental laws that require the transition to new energy. Why shouldn't we Africans take this advantage to give them conditions that if you are exploiting these resources from our continent, you must at least transform them there onto their finished goods before you export them to your countries, so that you also receive the finished goods that have been transformed, processed, and sold in our countries, because it's going to create jobs, it's going to create revenue, it's going to increase taxation, it's going to increase the circulation of money, because if we raise taxes on these resources that we don't consume, it's not going to affect us as much as when we raise taxes on bread, fish, sugar, and all the rest, right? So what do you think about hammering on this advantage we have around critical minerals now to force those who need these critical minerals to invest on our continent?
So I would like to start off by what may seem like bursting your bubble, Bernard. So this is not the first time that the development of humanity has hinged on a natural resource, right? And this is not the first time that an African country or Africa as a region has had these resources. So, for example, oil. Nigeria has plenty of reserves of oil, but the way that Saudi Arabia has exploited its oil reserves and a lot of petrol-rich countries is different from how African countries have. So I think we have to go back to understand that it actually is a disadvantage when we want to only center our economic development on commodities, given the way that the global economic terrain is structured, because it all goes back to the rules of the game. It all goes back to how the world economy is structured, the systems that run the economy, right? The global economy. So yes, we do have these resources. It's not the first time. Africa, DRC is one of the most mineral-rich countries in the world. I was looking at, you remember when I did the breakdown for you to say, when you look at cobalt, DRC has like 73% of global output of cobalt in 2022, I think. The largest supplier of manganese, the largest reserve of manganese in the world right now in South Africa. Lithium, my country, Zimbabwe, has plenty of resources of lithium. Recently, in the last decade or so, Zimbabwe discovered diamond reserves. Talk of any resource you think of, platinum. South Africa and Zimbabwe combined have some of the largest reserves, if not the first and second in terms of reserves in the world. But these are not going to benefit our people for as long as we are participating in world economics according to the rules of world economics. So we're going to be paid according to the rules. Our resources are going to be exploited according to the rules. And you also have to understand that the realities of actually using these minerals require capital to be present. So in as much as we have these resources, even exploiting them, like just simply mining them, extracting them, requires capital. Capital which our economies do not have. Sometimes it requires expertise which our economies sometimes do not have. But does that mean we should be going in these negotiations subservient to the countries that have capital? I think this is where our conversation begins. But going further and away from that, I think when I am saying that, because remember, I want to recenter our conversation to say, we're talking about foreign aid and its ability to spur economic growth in Africa. As long as Africa and African countries individually, so Africa as a collective, African countries individually, do not have a developmental ideology and policies that then align with that developmental ideology to then bring about tangible economic results, we are always going to be at the mercy of the people with the money. And what can also happen is that those with the money can play the economy because they have the money. So they can say, oh, you don't want with your resources, we'll go to this other country, perhaps another African country. And they're willing to do that. We can also go back to say that developmental ideology should then also translate into practical issues of governance that result in us being able to leverage these resources. So this is not impossible. This is not like an impossible dream. So when you look at the way diamonds are being exploited, for lack of a better word, in Botswana, right, the Botswana deal, De Beers and the Botswana government, it's different from the way that has been done, for example, in most African countries, including Zimbabwe, right? So what we need to really think about as Africans is to then say, how do we create a developmental agenda that is alive to our people, that is alive to what we have? And then how do we leverage what we do have right now, which is an abundance of mineral resources? First of all, to just make sure that, because think about this, whenever resources are found in Africa, most of the times a discovery of resources is followed by conflict. A discovery of resources is followed by war, right? So first of all, how do we get rid of that resource curse or burden as it is known, right? Where actually the discovery of these minerals has resulted in death, in conflict, in displacement of people. That's the first thing. Secondly, how can we then use and leverage this resource to spur the development of our economies, and to also make sure that then our economies develop from just being commodity markets, right? To be from not just being commodity suppliers, but actually build economies that can, provide and meet the demands of modern economies. So there are economies right now in the world that are doing way, way better than Africa, but without any significant natural resources in their countries. So our fixation with these resources and then the failure to actually manage them is also one of the reasons why Africa is still where it is today, because we do not control the game. The game is controlled somewhere else. We have the commodity is not priced by us. So this is where I think that conversation should then begin to start from, to say, first of all, how do we de-link conflict, wars, with the discovery of resources? And then how do we leverage our resources to support our development?
Thank you so much, Glenn. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us now, you are joining the Beyond Africa podcast. And today we are looking at aid, development, and economic growth on the continent. And our guest is Mr. Glen Dhliwayo, who is a Development and Policy Analyst. So, Glenn, let's... you mentioned that we needed to recalibrate, and effectively we need to recalibrate the conversation. But before we talk about aid, why aid has not taken off, you've mentioned something very important about the development agenda as one of the strategies that we could use to move Africa, to instill economic development in Africa. What else should Africans be doing to spur this economic development in Africa? Because from every indication, we need economic development if we want to attain our independence, our economic and political independence.
So a lot of these things that we're speaking about, they will stem from governance issues. So our governments need to be, like I said, they need to espouse developmentalism as the ideology, right? We need to institute good governance. And when I speak of good governance, I do not speak of it from the point of prescriptions from certain quarters in the world, but I'm speaking of good governance in relation to the needs of our people, right? We need to recenter, human rights, so that at the end of the day, the governed are together with those that govern. So when a government is the legitimacy that the people that they govern support them and they support the agenda that they have, development is more likely to occur, right? We need to look at the systems that we have in our own countries that support development, right? So it's a number of issues, but all of that comes back to then saying, what is our reality? Where do we want to go? And what policies can get us there? Now, the problem that we have right now is our leaders. You see, right now, there's a panic that there's going to be a shift in the global power structure. So some people are saying maybe we need to leave the dollar as the currency for international trade. The BRICS is probably going to come up with its own currency. But in all of these kind of scenarios that you think about, there is none where you see Africa coming up with solutions. Africa is forever going to be a recipient of solutions, right? We need to really examine the instruments that we use to drive our economy. Where are they coming from? It is not, I'm not saying that everything that comes, for example, from, because one of the things I feel like I need to talk about is, for example, SAP, structural adjustment programs, the prescriptions of the West, the IMF, the World Bank. These are some of the things that I'll probably want us to critique and be able to create a linkage between the realities on the continent right now and their prescriptions. So we need to start thinking about, when we get these prescriptions, how can we contextualize them for them to work for us? And one of the things that I find very instructive is to then say, as African leaders, we need visionary leaders who are able to, in some instances, defy conventional wisdom and say, this is what is going to work for our people. And when they do that, they do not do that from a dictatorial point of view, but consultative, participative democracy, where the people will give you a signal and then you go back as technocrats. So these are the bureaucrats, as political leaders, and you come up with solutions that are alive to where you are as a country and your aspirations. So there's a book that I talked about in the previous X space that we were in. It's called Kicking Away the Ladder by Harjun Cham. In that book, he speaks, he's an economist, but he gives a historical context of how the world top economies have developed. And then once they develop, they metaphorically, kick away the ladder, and then they start giving prescriptions to those developing and say, for example, use free market policies. But the question is, in and of themselves, free market policies are not bad. But for example, in a developing country that is 10 years out of independence, that is 80% of the people that were previously segregated before, that has a high unemployment rate, what do these translate into in terms of real realities of the people that you have? Sorry, before I forget this train of thought. Another clear case of this is the IMF is, there's what is known as the Washington Consensus, right? This is from 1989. There's a economist, John Williamson, who came up with a set of desirable economic reforms that should be required. So if you look at what is happening in Kenya right now, for example, as a very clear example, right? You'll find that you can create a link between that, because one of the things that the Washington Consensus pushes, which is a neoliberal agenda, is what? Tax reforms. Tax reforms, the tax base should be broad. And when you look at what Kenya did now in trying to bring up this new finance bill, it's trying to meet the prescriptions of the IMF to then say generate more revenue. But when it then passes these taxes, is it alive to the realities of the people in Kenya right now? So this is a question I would ask if I was a leader, to then say, okay, this sounds good on paper, but this is an obvious backlash that you'd expect, that your people are not ready for that, right? So yeah, I know you're about to come in with an interjection here. Let me pause.
Yeah, I was interested in drawing a connection between the free market, that is a capitalism, and the prescriptions, the beautiful description you've given about linking the free market to our local realities, right? That sounds to me very important. Are you proposing that we should leave the free market out and use another system, or are you proposing that we should adapt the free market to our local realities?
Look, I mean, all of these labels are given to either ideologies or conventional ways of doing things, right? But it is quite possible that governments can actually create policy by policy that is meant to come to a reality, right? So for example, if you realize that your economy is underdeveloped, so it is wholly a consumer economy, imports. So you're now starting to think, when you look at how the USA and China are engaging each other, there's often the word of the use of trade wars, using tariffs as a way to protect local industries, or to say, this is how we'll protect our economy, so we're going to use tariffs. Now, when you then look at what free market policies say, what do they say? They say you should have trade liberalization, right? What does trade liberalization mean? Trade liberalization means open up your borders, let anyone who has products, bring them in your economies. At the beginning of the boom of Chinese manufacturing, you realize that at some point African countries became a sort of dumping place for low quality products, but still taking money, mopping money from our economies. But also the other effect of that, the impact of that, is that our local industries cannot develop anymore because there's cheaper products that are coming in from somewhere else. And so that means a young person from Cameroon who's trying to start up a SME is not able to compete with someone who's, first of all, there are many other things to consider there, but there are also currency considerations, right? Now, this young person, this young enterprise, this small business, this medium enterprise is going to close off. When it closes off, what is the ripple effect? There are 10 people employed there, they're losing jobs. If it's a medium enterprise, 100 people there are losing jobs. But these people still need to eat. These people still need to buy these products that are coming from outside. What is the greater impact again? You are now a net importer of products, right? So all of these things, when you then look at them, is to say, maybe we're not saying free market policies don't work, right? Maybe we are saying, for example, one of the tenets of free market policies is to say reduce government spending. But we are saying, as a government, we know that our people, 70% are not in full-time employment or informal employment. So if we then say whenever you go to see a doctor, you have to pay, and the government will not subsidize healthcare. What does that mean? It means we're going to have undesirable health outcomes, right? So you're able to push back as an African leader and then say, we are still going to pursue the education, a subsidized education and healthcare for our people, because our people are not yet in a place where they can actually afford quality education. When the time comes where our country and our people can afford, then we can revisit this conversation. So yes, we can say bring in free market policies of protecting property rights. They're okay. We can look into saying managing interest rates, exchange rates, and everything, and playing according to the global playbook. But we shouldn't overtax our people when it comes to education and health, because that is our reality.
Thank you so much. I want us now to move away from the labels, free market, neoliberalism, capitalism. Can you just give me a few examples of what you think our governments should do to, one, satisfy our people's needs, and two, an economy that can satisfy our people's needs in Africa?
Hey, you've put me on the spot on that one. But I think one of the most important things that we need in Africa is a clear definition of the social contract. People who are leading in Africa need to understand that they are representatives. They are elected. They've got bosses, and their boss is the one who they go to every 4 years, every 5 years, to then say, hey, please vote for me. Now, that first thing, respecting that relationship where the voter, the electorate is on top of that chain, right? And what we see in Africa right now is a lot of leaders who disregard their people. So they're not moving with their people. And that you'll see, it then emanates and reflects in things like social unrest. It emanates in sometimes these governments clamping down on freedoms of people. Because when you know that the people you're governing are not allowing, you're not governing from their free will, you then have to resort to other means, right? So we need that to make sure that the political fundamentals of voters selecting their government and the government working and being answerable and accountable to the people and being transparent to the people is there. That's the first thing. Secondly, create and define a clear social contract to say, what is the state promising its people? The state is promising, so some of these things are clearly stated in the Bill of Rights of the Constitution. So it will state that everyone has a right to health. What does that mean? How do we do that? The third thing is to make sure that we create an equal platform for citizens. We create equality for citizens, because one of the triple challenges that we have in Africa, we have the challenge of poverty, right? We have poverty, we have inequality, and we have injustice. So reading the economy of the countries, African countries of inequality, injustice, and poverty. So maybe poverty requires economic policies. Inequality requires us to then look at how are we structuring the economy, because inequality is usually a reflection of structural issues of access. So in Africa, sometimes you see that we have the politics of clientelism, where for you to get something, you have to affiliate with someone. It's not entitled to you as a right, as a citizen. You have to support someone. When you support me, then I'll do this for you. I'll give you a mine, I'll give you a farm, I'll give you access, I'll give you tenders, right? But we need to get rid of that. Corruption, misgovernance, right? Then also we have to create an environment where government can actually plan and enact and implement policies, right? For that to happen, it means we need to have relative peace. And right now in Africa, in the past 2 to 3 years, we've seen how many coups. We've seen a lot of military takeovers. Even in other countries where this has not happened, there is unrest. So we need to be able to make sure that as a continent, at some point, we create a stable period of peace, relative peace, where the countries can then get on with the business of structuring their economies and creating policies that will run these economies into development. Without peace, there's no development to talk about in the first place. Then finally, I think the important thing, which I've been saying over and over again, is to then say, Africa needs to have the capacity and the vision to compete globally, economically. Most of the times we have leaders who are able to gain power. They are great at political maneuvering, at wielding the instruments of power, the instruments of that give them that monopoly of violence, right? They are able to do that. But when it comes to actually structuring a modern economy that works, they are failing, which is why sometimes a country can succeed in creating good graduates, but there are no jobs for them. And this is why they then complain that, oh, our young people, there's brain drain, our young people are living to other places, because the economy cannot absorb these people, because now you've created people who are educated. When they're educated, you can't expect them to just sit down, and they have the energy, because Africa is the demographic dividend is enjoying now in terms of age, right? Other countries are actually trying to attract talent and people who can work because they have aging economies. We have youthful economies, right? So we have to have leaders who are then able to say, how do I build and develop how do we build a competitive modern economy that is able to, number one, respond to the needs of our people, but also number two, compete fairly and not from a disadvantaged position in the global economic field.
Thank you so much, Glenn. You've touched on very critical issues there, and I think we need to dig deeply into those issues. One of them is, I would like us to have another conversation like this some other time to talk about the education that is ripe and right for Africa as it stands. We'll talk about that some other time. We are running out of time, and I would like us to touch on why development aid, foreign assistance has not worked in Africa. What is your perspective on that?
I mean, I cannot prescriptively speak and authoritatively say it right now, but I'll speak to some of the things that I've been saying in the duration of this conversation we're having, Bernard, to say there are many issues to aid. So first of all, there's the issue of conditionality, right? For us to give you this, you have to do that. And it means that, as first of all, the whole idea of aid, I am in a place where I actually prefer economic cooperation. And of course, where you need things like there's an incident like a natural disaster, then humanitarian assistance is necessary. But we cannot have countries that have a whole education budget for 10 years, 20 years even, being sponsored through aid, being financed through aid. That very same time, that particular country can set aside 30% of its budget towards the acquisition of military, or maybe towards defense. So how do you have a defense in a country that is in relative peace? 30% of your budget is going there, and then you don't have, your education is mostly subsidized or paid for by foreign governments. I think we need to have a relook at aid and think about, first of all, the inequality that is already existing in aid, to say, normally the one who gives has power over the one who receives, which is why also before that aid comes, it comes with conditions, it comes with certain things that you must do. So that alone has put us in a place where sometimes we are accepting aid with conditions that may not be fit for where we are, right? That's the first thing. Secondly, those that give aid have their priorities. And sometimes their priorities are not in sync with the realities of those that are receiving. So for example, right now, the rest of the world is thinking about sustainability, right? And they're thinking about, we need to move to electric vehicles, we need to move to green energy, we need to move to A, B, C, D. When our countries as recipients of this aid, if they're not able to push back on certain things to say, hey, this is our reality, for us to be at a place to achieve A, B, C, D, this is what we need. I always give an example of a development story. I don't know, is it just from my country, but where development experts came in a place and said, we need to to solve the problem of is it deforestation. But what they didn't understand is that at the end of the day, people do not have alternative sources of fuel to cook, right? So when you're just coming and say, let's plant trees, what is the alternative for these people to use as a source for cooking? Because people are not going to care about what is going to happen to the environment 50 years from now. They care about what they have in the stomach today. So we have to have an alignment of our expected outcomes and the lived realities of people. What do people need today? What is the desirable outcome that we want? How can we marry the two to make sure that the funding that is coming in is able to answer sustainably and lead us to the point where we then achieve our broader goals? So sometimes we have this top-down approach. It's not only from a country to country, or maybe from the global north to the global south, but even sometimes within our countries, those that work as NGOs, the government departments, sometimes they are not alive to the realities of the people that they are saying they are benefiting in their development programs. So they will come up with solutions that won't work. Put up infrastructure. So many times we have examples of white elephants, like infrastructure that is not working because the people do not need that at that particular time. So we need to democratize development, make it more participatory, and then say, how do we bring the person at the grassroots, the actual recipients of this, who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of this aid, to structure it and design it from the beginning? So what we have is a situation where those that have funds are deciding to say, these are your priorities, take them. But maybe these are not the priorities of the communities that they're going to, of the countries that they're going to. But people will not say no to money. They will take the money, but it won't result in development. So that's the other thing. Then finally, I would also then say, I think that we need to have a balance between investment and aid. Why? Because if you give me money today, you give us a budget. So many times you've heard of statements like donor fatigue. The donors are tired. Sometimes it doesn't mean the problem is solved. It's just the donors are tired of this one issue. Nothing has changed. Because year in, we submit our budgets, we get the money. Next year, we submit our budgets, we get the money. Situation like COVID happens in the world where now even those that have the money, the countries that are rich, they now have to reassess their priorities, and they'll start thinking, even their people are giving them the pressure to say, why are we sending so much money to other countries to support other countries' development when we have these problems at home? But when it's investment, it is clear business transactions where it's mutually beneficial, it's negotiated, it's structured to make sure that those who get capital get their profits, but also those where the business is happening, they get their development, and also they get their part of the deal. So I also think that we need to have that balance. Yes, we cannot do away with aid right now totally, but we need to rethink the way aid is being given out, the way even the global funding ecosystem works. Then we also need to bring the people in, not just aid, but can we also have an equitable financial investment?
Thank you so much, Glenn. That sounded some sort of a good lecture about aid and its understanding on the continent, because most often the aid givers don't actually understand the realities on the ground, and that could explain why the aid itself has not moved the needle when it comes to economic development. And you said something I find very interesting, and I think everybody should note that, which is we need aid, but the type of aid that we need must be defined, and that is humanitarian aid, humanitarian assistance. When we are in difficult humanitarian situations, of course, nobody calls for difficult humanitarian situations, but when we're in that situation, we need help. But then we need to look out of the box and see how we can develop ourselves, not necessarily with aid, but with things like social entrepreneurship, where we focus on monetizing what we are doing to yield profit from what we are doing to reinvest it in our communities, so that we continue investing and creating values for our community. Because if we don't do this, if we keep on depending on aid, we would definitely remain on one spot and doing nothing. And when the person who gives it refuses to give it at some point, the little that we had or the nothing that we had becomes an absolute nothing, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I totally agree with you, and I think we need to have this mindset that development assistance has not really moved the needle on the continent, and we need to start thinking about investments and trade and how we can improve our own selves without necessarily waiting on others. You use an example.
But let me also just emphasize, Bernard, that I think it's important to not say aid alone is not effective, because I mean the instances where aid has actually transformed situations, so many instances. So, for example, the fight against HIV and AIDS. My point in saying looking at it as a developmental tool is just, I think we need to relook the inequalities in aid itself as well, to say who is driving the agenda is very important. Who's setting the priorities, right? So it shouldn't be an unequal relationship of donor and recipient, but it should be design this process together from the beginning to the end. So you're doing it with the recipients of that aid in mind. So it's not, we are giving you this money, do A, B, C, D. So that's why I also spoke of conditionality and priorities. I think it has to be participatory, it has to be made more equal, it has to be more democratized than it has been before. So yeah, I just needed to emphasize that point.
That emphasis is very necessary. Are you thinking at any point that some aid donors would actually willingly decide to discuss with the people and agree on what the people want, or they want to drive their agendas?
I think the conversation has started taking place, because when the whole sector began, it was an issue of someone in Geneva or someone in Washington sitting down in their office and then just deciding, okay, I've got 10 billion to send to Africa, then tell them do this with that money. But I think the call has been clear now to say, you can't just export your agenda to us. In actual fact, involve us from the program design, right from the onset, to say, what are the priorities and what are the issues in your communities, and how do we come together with the solution? And I think there are so many things you can then speak about. It's just that we have an hour here and we're almost done. But it also even goes to the point where before, those in Washington, for example, in Geneva would then send, or in The Hague, would then send the experts. They come to Africa, they disregard even local knowledge, local systems, local ways of doing things. They think they know more than those that are on the ground. They traditionally look at those in Africa as corrupt, and those that are that are coming in are not. So many issues, but the conversation to start saying, let's make it more equal, has started going on. I think what is important is the actual political will, even within the funding space, to say, you have the money, yes, but if you're sincere in saying we're doing this, let's now do it more as a partnership where we are both targeting an issue and we are working on it together collaboratively. There's no hierarchies that are, so because the donor just said do A, B, C, D, you have to do it. You can push back to say, but these are our priorities, we think this way. So I think we will get to that point, because also even countries are also beginning to put in place legislation to ensure that also the people are protected, that this aid is actually going to be usefully used as well.
Thank you so much. I think we will need to come back. We'll need to have a conversation about that in the future, where we look at what actually holds aid from realizing its objectives on the continent of Africa and anywhere else in the world. And you have highlighted them, but as you said, we are out of time, and we'll talk about that. So that's a second programs conversation we have already taken in this conversation. One is on education, and then the other one is on why aid has not worked and those conditionalities. But before I let you go, there is one question I wanted to ask. You said it is important that those who make the aid decisions in Geneva, Paris, DC, London, and all the rest, they need to contact us. Who is the us? Is it us in the rural communities where the aid project is supposed to be executed, or is it us, the government, sitting in the capital cities and connecting with these diplomats and donors?
I think at the heart of my submission there, Bernard, it was just saying, So you've realized a situation where you've got an international NGO that is headquartered in the UK, offices in the UK. They just come and they do a project and they leave, for example. Or there's an organization called Education for Africa, and everyone in the board of that organization is not from Africa, not living in Africa, never lived in Africa. The decision makers are not in Africa, never lived in Africa, and not residing in Africa. And then even when they implement, the key people, even the consultants they hire, the people that they work with, they then just find a few local people to then just work with. And mostly these people are given instructions. They are not involved in the decision making of these organizations, for example. So when I am saying they need to involve us, I mean the people in the communities that they intend to serve. I mean the actual beneficiaries of the work that they intend to do. So if you want to work on, for example, something I've worked on before, adolescent sexual and reproductive health rights, you need to involve people in the particular area that you want to work with. Hear their voice, hear their issues, involve them in coming up with the solution, and also have them as part of the people who are monitoring and making sure that this work is being done, the people you report and account to. When you have a scenario where decisions are made elsewhere, reports are submitted elsewhere, and then the people who are supposed to be receiving interventions are not even involved, it will most likely not work because they are not involved.
That was a fascinating last word. This has been an interesting conversation, and I've enjoyed every bit of it. Before I let you go, do you have any last word again?
I think I just wanted to thank you for creating this platform where we can discuss African issues in a very relaxed way. And I think that the answers we are seeking are not going to be found in one conversation. They're not going to probably found in this year. But I think that the more we speak, the more we discuss, the more we reach out one to another, even across borders as Africa, the more we find each other. Eventually, we should be able to hear each other, come up with solutions, and actually realize that dream that we want. It is quite possible, but we need to be invested to make sure that we push that agenda and make it work.
That is the essence for which we created this platform, so that we Africans talk amongst ourselves. Traditional media is good. It is telling us what we need to hear, sometimes what we don't need to hear. Sometimes it doesn't tell us everything that we need to hear. But above all, it doesn't give all of us the opportunity to talk about what we think needs to change on the continent. This platform democratizes that process, gives everybody the ability to share their minds, to share their opinions. And of course, our leaders are going to listen to us. Our leaders are going to be on this platform and on other platforms. So we encourage everyone with an opinion, with something burning in you about the development of the African continent, to reach out. Talk to us. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you so much for coming. And I believe that our listeners have learned a lot. And of course, they would like to have you here again sometime in the future.
Thank you, Bernard. It was a pleasure.
The pleasure is shared. Thank you so much for coming, Glenn.
Thank you.
Dear viewers, this was Beyond Africa, the Beyond Africa podcast. And at the anchor, I have been Ngalim Bernard. And at the techniques, we've had Lami Godlove. And before we leave, we wish you a happy Sunday, happy week, and see you next time.